This film is going to cover the period of the 60s and Vietnam, and we are also going to look at Nixon's administration and Ford's administration and some of the legacy of Vietnam as well. The first point I want to make about Lyndon B. Johnson, following his coming to power after the assassination of JFK, Johnson really wanted to be remembered as for his social programs. He had a social program called the Great Society that he really wanted to promote. He's also very well known for continuing Kennedy's support and his own support for civil rights legislation. Remember, we talked about the 1963 March on Washington, the importance of Dr. Martin Luther King and his I Have a Dream speech, and pushing for greater civil rights legislation. So with the death of Kennedy, it's Johnson who will sign into legislation the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which will prohibit discrimination in public places. No more Jim Crow segregation and discrimination in public places based on race, religion, national origin, or gender. This will therefore desegregate public accommodations. The other important, significant civil rights legislation that was passed was the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act outlawed literacy tests, which had for years disenfranchised African Americans in the South in particular. It provided federal registrars in the South to make sure that African American voters were being registered to vote, and therefore all of these measures with the Voting Rights Act helped to increase African American participation and their enfranchisement as part of the voting public. So remember, those two laws are significant outcomes of the civil rights movement, and Johnson was in office when that legislation was signed. For Johnson, however, the main thing that he gets associated with is Vietnam. Under Kennedy's administration, military advisors had been presented to South Vietnam to fight against communist aggression, but the question remained whether or not we should escalate our involvement. There's a couple of phone calls that we listened to, Johnson mulling over what he should do. He doesn't want to appear weak in Southeast Asia for fear that communism will spread, but he's worried about getting America involved in a conflict that would be difficult to get out of. So he's weighing his options. Ultimately, he does decide to escalate U.S. involvement. This comes after the U.S. destroyer Maddox was reportedly attacked by the North Vietnamese in international waters in the Gulf of Tonkin. And so the Gulf of Tonkin resolution allows Congress approves the president's use of all necessary powers to stop the aggression. So technically, the Vietnam War, much like the Korean conflict we looked at, is not a declared war. The Gulf of Tonkin resolutions allows the American government to act in the name of containing communism and communist aggression. So the United States will open up continual bombing of North Vietnam to try to limit their ability to infiltrate the southern democratic section of Vietnam. By the time you get to 1965, there is an escalation of the war. By the time you get to 1968, there's 500,000 American troops. So it's during the 60s that the Vietnam conflict and American involvement escalates. There's tremendous challenges in fighting in Vietnam, partly because the communist Viet Cong that were fighting in South Vietnam are embedded within the civilian population. So when strikes against the communists are made, it's very difficult to distinguish enemy from friend because they're embedded in the civilian population. The Viet Cong very quickly disappear into the jungles. It's hard to look for them with the landmines and the traps that have been supported in the jungles. The Viet Cong are supported by the Soviets and the Chinese, also communist. So the United States can win in terms of firepower and technology, but it's very hard to force an end to the war against the communists in Vietnam through a limited war. We don't want to broaden it to include the Soviets and the Chinese, but it's very difficult fighting the Viet Cong in Vietnam as they're embedded in the civilian population. So the war becomes very controversial at home into the 60s. A lot of people will dodge the draft. A lot of people will question whether or not this is something America needed to be involved in. A lot of people will say that Vietnam was more of a civil war between the Vietnamese people and question the morality of our combat techniques as we try to defeat the Viet Cong. A lot of these protests will be centered on college campuses and will coincide with the hippie movement and the counterculture movement. So you see a lot of signs, peace, love, not war. The fear that America has gotten itself into something that's going to be a prolonged conflict that particularly is going to affect young people who are being drafted into military service. So a lot of protest at home. 1968, the Viet Cong will lead a series of surprise attacks on South Vietnam. It's called the Tet Offensive, and even though the United States will take back several of those cities and kill several Viet Cong in the process, it just proves that even at this late date, 1968, it appears that we're not winning, that Vietnam has become a bit of a quagmire we're stuck in and we can't figure out how to get out. So by 1968, the percentage of Americans disapproving of LBJ's handling of Vietnam is 60%. So Johnson will make an announcement that he will not seek re-election as President of the United States. So essentially, America's opinion, the protest, and the lack of support for Vietnam is a deciding factor for Johnson in not running. He's lost support of the American public. So this is a real important example of America's public opinion kind of changing policy and changing decisions that are made even at the highest office of government. Nixon will be elected in 1968 promising an honorable end. So he's elected promising to find an honorable end to Vietnam. And his honorable end is what's called Vietnamization. And essentially what this called for was withdrawing American troops over time and replacing them with the South Vietnamese. So we would train them, and then American troops would be withdrawn and allow the South Vietnamese to fight the battles against the communist aggression. All the while, we would maintain our military support for South Vietnam. This becomes quite controversial because while Americans believed that Nixon was promising a way out, Nixon secretly began bombing neighboring Cambodia to try to break up the Ho Chi Minh Trail, that supportive trail from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. This was exposed and became very unpopular. There was a wave of student protest again. The famous picture at Kent State where student protests led to troops getting involved to break up the student protest, and some students were shot and killed. And so this was in 1970. So this Vietnam, it seems to be tearing us apart here at home. And of course this is a critical sort of cartoon ever since Eisenhower and then Kennedy with the advisors that we sent. Johnson has escalated the war, and then Nixon has promised a way out, but now he's opened up bombing in Cambodia. It's like, where's our policy? It's like the blind leading the blind with regard to Vietnam. So it continued to be unpopular even after Nixon had promised an honorable end. In other areas of foreign policy, Nixon did a bit better. A policy of détente was a policy of easing Cold War tensions. This was based on his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger's ideas of realpolitik, that America needed to look at the world and the balance of power based on power and not ideas. So if there's a powerful country that just happens to be communist, we might want to open up talks with that country based on power relations rather than values and ideas. So Nixon will actually travel to China and meet with communist leader Mao Zedong. He'll later visit the Soviet Union, and so he's playing off through negotiations with both of those countries these communist rivalries to try to open up discussions and ease the tensions of the Cold War during the 70s, during his time in office. The problem for Nixon, as he was trying to negotiate ends to Vietnam and negotiate some easing of tensions in the Cold War, is that he ends up discrediting himself, in part because he became a paranoid politician. He was worried about re-election. He had a committee formed to re-elect the president called CREEP, and they broke into the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate Hotel complex in Washington, D.C., and Nixon will always argue that he had nothing to do with the break-in, but then more and more evidence comes up, and it seems like the president is hiding his direct involvement in the Watergate scandal. So ultimately, the Watergate scandal brings an end to Nixon. Nixon will have to resign from office, and Gerald Ford, who was the vice president of Nixon, will take office. And Ford will actually pardon Nixon. He'll try to move the country beyond the Watergate scandal that had forced Nixon to resign and to focus on trying to once again bring an end to Vietnam. In the end, the policies of Nixon in Vietnam also fail. Vietnamization does not work. When American troops are pulled out, the South Vietnamese are not able to resist communist aggression, and so South Vietnam will fall in 1975 to the North Vietnamese. The communists will unite Vietnam as one country. It will become a communist country, and Saigon, which had been the democratic capital of the South, democratic South Vietnam, will be renamed Ho Chi Minh City after the communist leader. And so these are pictures showing American diplomats, their families, South Vietnamese that had supported democracy and American policies, trying to evacuate as Saigon falls to the communist. Unlike veterans from World War II, Vietnam veterans will return home to face indifference, hostility from people who opposed the war. And it will not be until several years later that veterans of the Vietnam War will be recognized for their service. In 1982, the vets were honored for their service with the building of the wall. There are 58,000 names on the wall marking those who died in Vietnam. And every day there's little memorials that are set to remember those who lost their lives in Vietnam. By 1995, the U.S. will extend full diplomatic relations to Vietnam. This would be during the Bill Clinton years. And Clinton will say, let this moment be a time to heal and a time to rebuild. So by the 90s, America will open up diplomatic relations. So that's a summary of Vietnam. Please review these slides. Please review the names and the policies associated with them. And then we'll wrap up the Cold War in the next video.